Today we want to talk about soil organic matter. Almost all life found in soils depend on organic matter for energy and nutrients in one way or the other. It is really important for retaining nutrients and also for retaining potentially toxic organic and inorganic substances. It has high cation exchange capacity. And not only that, it has higher cation exchange capacity than most clay minerals. It is really important for water handling of soils. It improves water retention capacity, and it also improves infiltration capacity as it eases the infiltration of water into soils. So organic matter is really important for maintaining good soil structure and enhances aggregation. And so organic matter is the largest terrestrial carbon storage pool and is therefore really important for the global carbon budget. So the organic matter in soils comes about because we have the incorporation, decomposition, and breakdown of large organic molecules into simpler compounds, where we take compounds such as our simple glucose here and we're oxidizing them to produce carbon dioxide, water, and releasing energy in the process. So what happens is that we use oxygen or some other electron acceptor, and we have a carbon compound. And soil organic matter as a carbon compound is the most important electron donators in soils that provide energy for organisms. Well, in the process, and if we had a carbon structure more complicated than the little glucose here in front of us, we would also release and or immobilize nutrients such as nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and other elements, and in the process also form microbial compounds that can be stabilized in soils. So we take some of those nutrients, we mineralize them, we make them available, and then they can be taken up again by plants and can be immobilized. So mineralization frees up nutrients, makes them usable to plants, also makes them mobile in soils, and immobilization stores them as organic materials or as part of the living organic matter in soils. So then what is the organic matter? What is the organic carbon and where can we find it? Well, it turns out that if you were to analyze it, you'd find that 85% of that organic material is dead organic material, and 8.5% are live roots, and the remainder are living things in soil. So by definition, organic matter combines all this, the dead and the alive organic carbon that is found in soils. Well, of the living things, the majority of those, as we've learned in the previous video, are microorganisms, bacteria and fungi predominantly, and then the rest is made up by larger fauna in the system. So where do we find all this organic matter or organic carbon in the soils? If we look at the depth distribution of organic carbon, we may find that in a forest system we would have this exponential decline of organic carbon percentages with depth, where we find the highest concentration of organic carbon in the forest floor and in the O and A horizons. In a forest, it will typically range between 2 and 10%. The duff layer, of course, will be way higher than that. In an agricultural soil, because of the management, we have higher mixing, which explains that we have a more uniform distribution, at least in the A horizon, and then a faster decline following this. As part of the management that we do in agriculture, we also expose the organic matter in the soil to more oxidation, which means that overall our percentage of organic carbon in agricultural soil tends to be much lower than that in forest soils. So the other question that you may ask yourself then is, well, okay, so if all this organic matter includes live things and dead organic matter, if we were to parcel out what exactly it is composed of, we'd find that, well, 3/4 of it are water, and then the remainder is dry matter. And then this dry matter, if you were to break it out into what it is, you'd find that a good portion of that would be cellulose or hemicellulose, some 20% or so of lignins, some proteins, small percentage, 3, 4, 5% sugars and starches, and the rest being fats, waxes, and polyphenols. So not all organic carbon obviously is made up the same way. Some of these structures are going to be way easier to digest. Those are going to be the sugars and starches, and some of them are going to be really hard to eat or to be used as a food source and are going to be way more resistant to further decay. So lignin would be a good example for that. So if you were to take all of these, regardless of whether it's cellulose or proteins or fats and waxes, if you were to analyze organic matter as a whole for their elemental composition, you'd find that it's actually rather boring looking. It's mostly carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and then a small percentage being composed of what we would call nutrients, or whatever is left that we don't consider as nutrients. That would be the ash percentage of the elements. The way that organic matter enters the soil, gets incorporated into soil, and eventually becomes soil organic matter starts with the senescence and litter fall of plant material. As part of that, we're starting transformation processes, including the degradation of chlorophyll, but we still have most of the carotenoids present, and these are the substances that give the leaves yellow, orange, or red colors, and carotene that we as humans consume is part of these carotenoids. As part of this degradation process, large portions of the mineral nutrients, the potassiums, manganese, and calcium, and so forth, are already being released. The next step in the process is the mechanical fragmentation. So here we have earthworms, woodlice, mites, whatever else, mechanically breaking it down and starting the digestion process. As part of this, we also start the microbial infestation of the litter, and that starts the hydrolytic decomposition of the organic materials. And lastly, we come to the microbial degradation and transformation. So here we have fast mineralization of carbohydrates, sugars, starches, cellulases, and hemicelluloses. So anything that is really non-wooden gets fastly consumed, and everything else that is more resistant to decomposition gets fragmented into smaller units by enzymes, which then help with the further uptake of microorganisms. And lignin will be the most stable compound of the two, and there's only a few microorganisms that are capable of degrading lignins, and both of these are fungi. It's the brown rot fungi, which decomposes polysaccharides, and the white rot fungi, which helps with the decomposition of lignin and polysaccharides. So now we're ready to put everything that we've learned about the formation of soil organic matter on one sheet. So we start with plants that provide plant litter or plant residue, and we've learned that the chemical composition of that litter very much affects the litter decomposition. So we have some simple compounds, some more resistant compounds, and if for a moment we follow the pathway of the simple compounds, we can have microbes rapidly mineralizing these and freeing up simple end products such as carbon dioxide, water, and all the nutrients that we may be interested in. And then these nutrients in turn can be readily reused or immobilized by plants, and thereby complete the circle of nutrients in the system. Well, some of these simple compounds that may be more on the more resistant of the least resistant side may not be so rapidly mineralized, but there may be a food chain involved where life in soil, we use them as a food source, might have to get some of the other constituents that aren't found directly in that food and get them from the mobile and soluble products that are now available, and thereby immobilize some of these simple end products. And then, of course, the food web continues thereon. These microbes and other life are going to continue to digest the material and eventually come to the point where we're left over with relatively stable organic compounds that are not readily decomposable anymore, and we might call that humus then. This humus, of course, slowly mineralizes and provides simple end products in a very, very long-term process. So it provides sort of a storage mechanism where we have a more long-term locking away of some of these minerals. The more resistant compounds that we started out with in the plant residues, of course, get broken down as well, and we've learned that fungi and bacteria are involved in this and provide a slow decay towards these more stabilized organic substances. So what exactly then is humus, and how do you make it? Well, it's actually pretty easy. You make it at home. All you need is some garbanzos, olive oil, tahini, add some lemon juice, garlic, salt, pepper, whatever else you like to taste, and you're done. Oh wait, that was hummus, not humus. And well, in some sense, the same way that people cannot really agree what is the best recipe for hummus and what constitutes hummus, it's the same with humus. And especially as soil scientists, we've come to be really uncomfortable with the term humus. But let me try to give you some perspective of what it may be and why maybe stable organic matter is a better term for it. Another way to look at organic matter is to look at this as in some of it is made up of fresh litter, some of it is made up of living organisms, and some of it may be considered active organic matter. So this active organic matter in some sense is the detritus. It is the part that actively undergoes decomposition and rapid decomposition. And therefore it's really important for soil fertility because it is here where the immobilization and mineralization of nutrients happens. The remaining part is the part that maybe you could refer to as humus or you could refer to it as stabilized organic matter. In a lot of sense, this is the final product of decomposition, which also is part of why it is stabilized. This stabilized part is characterized by more or less being an amorphous mixture of substrates that may not be identifiable anymore as tissues, but it still is going to be in various forms of decomposition. The other way that you could look at this is that, well, as we are taking active and create more stabilized organic matter, we increase the number of carboxylic and phenolic groups which have hydroxyls hanging off them. And it is these hydroxyls that can be exchanged for cations, which provide the large cation exchange capacity that we associate with this humus, the stabilized organic matter or organic matter in total. So how do we go from the active to the stabilized? Well, in some sense, it's a selective preservation. The lignin, for example, is going to be more of the stabilized part than the more readily digested materials. It is also because there's interactions with mineral surfaces. So some of the organic material likes to make coatings on mineral surfaces or metallic surfaces and thereby prevent it from further decomposition. So that would be a way of stabilizing it. The other one would be to make it inaccessible. And ways to make it inaccessible are if you include it into aggregates where the pores are so small that none of the decomposers can readily get into it, or you transport the organic matter into deep mineral subsoil where life is going to be less prevalent, and you can have some intercalation with phyllosilicates as well. However, there's one more way that maybe you could define humus or stabilized organic matter, and that is to look at the carbon to nitrogen ratio. And oftentimes, the stabilized part or the humus part will exhibit carbon to nitrogen ratios in the order of 10 to 12. So up until now, we haven't actually looked at the mass balance of the organic matter. If we were to start with about 100 grams of green tissue, dead animals, all the stuff that decomposes to form stabilized organic matter, we put it into the environment and we have earthworms and termites that are shredding and feeding on it, we'd find that they might assimilate about 5 grams of that organic matter, and then they would poop out some partly digested material, and the remainder of the 100 grams would go through digestion by microbes. So we'd have 5 grams assimilated in the worms, 5 grams partly digested, meaning it's partially immobilized by living organisms, and eventually we form about 20 grams of stabilized organic matter, which has lots of hydroxyl groups, high cation exchange capacity, adds to soil structure and soil water holding capacity and so forth. Well, so if you do the mass balance here, you notice, well, wait a minute, we got 20 grams of stabilized organic matter, 5 grams assimilated, 5 grams that are cycling through the food chain in some sense. What happened to the remaining 70 grams? Well, they are released into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, so all the carbon dioxide released during respiration. So the other thing that happens as we go from 100 grams of organic matter to 20 grams of stabilized organic matter is that the carbon to nitrogen ratio changes. So it might start out with the material that might be 100 to 1, but of course it's highly variable depending on what kind of food you add to the system or what is available in a given ecosystem. And then we might end up, like we said on the previous slide, with a carbon to nitrogen ratio in the order of 10 to 12 to 1. So soil microbes are, as we've learned, the primary agents for organic matter decomposition, and they have certain dietary requirements. Of major concern is the amount of carbon relative to nitrogen in the decomposing organic matter. So the United States Department of Organic Matter has brought out nutritional guidelines for microbe nutrition, stating that they should have an ideal carbon to nitrogen ratio of 24 to 1. Well, if you look at the elemental composition of microbes, you'll find that their carbon to nitrogen ratio is 8 to 1. So how come they want 24 to 1 as their food? Well, if you consider that as they eat food, they also have to respire, expend energy, and use some of the food that they use for maintenance of their bodies, then you'll get to them having to have a nutritional requirement of about 24 to 1. A problem arises mostly when the nitrogen content of the food is small, because then the microbes may become deprived of nitrogen and compete with higher plants for whatever available nitrogen exists in the soil. So take, for example, here a timeline of adding a food that is high in carbon to nitrogen ratio. High carbon to nitrogen ratio means there is low availability of nitrogen in the food. There's a whole bunch of carbon in it. So sawdust and straw would be good examples for foods that are high in carbon to nitrogen ratio. And if we look at the biological activity here on the blue line, and I label this as CO2 emissions as an indicator for biological activity, because as they eat the food, they respire carbon dioxide. So you'll see here that for a high carbon to nitrogen ratio, we have a competition for nitrogen, which means that the nitrogen availability tanks and that the microbes suffer a shortage as they begin decomposing. So they have to get the nitrogen from the soil, but that costs them energy and slows down the decomposition rate. Also means that they do emit some more CO2 for the same amount of decomposition. And it also means that the decline in the carbon to nitrogen ratio of the food added towards becoming stabilized organic matter means that we have a higher proportion of carbon or a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio in the resulting stabilized organic matter. So contrast that with food added that has a low carbon to nitrogen ratio, meaning we have comparatively more nitrogen available. Here, the mineralized nitrogen will be released soon after the decay starts. So you see there's a little bit of an initiation phase where nitrogen availability drops a little bit, but after that, there is no shortage of nitrogen available in the system, and we have, in the end, a higher proportion of total carbon in the easily decomposable compounds.